So I'm Issa. I feel Sonia, Lorenzo, Dan, they mentioned a lot of the challenges in using external controls, especially pure external controls. And I wanted to talk about the idea of possibly using the external controls to make a smaller trial or a trial with an unequal allocation, as in a hybrid design. And so to do this, I want to talk about three ideas. The first one is the general idea of using models, possibly from external data in clinical trials. Then discuss how you should think when you're not feeling lucky, which happens to me a lot, and specific to the case of external data, and then maybe talk a little bit about a specific method for what we call trial augmentation and how that would feed into the design of future trials. And so to start this conversation, I need some grounding on actual trials, just as a standalone beautiful thing. And so I'm going to make some statement here that even if you are unwilling to make any assumptions beyond those justified by the design, we know how to do the optimal analysis of your randomized trial. And what I have in mind here is an analysis that leverages randomization, is covariate adjusted, model robust, and delivers the most efficient possible approach for the marginal treatment effect in large samples. So sometimes people say, what does this even mean? Let me try to define. When I say covariate adjustment, I have in mind that we are going to try to incorporate information on the covariate outcome association, almost always through some kind of outcome regression model. So I'm going to do a regression of the outcome on covariates, maybe separately in the arms of my trial. When I say model robust, I mean that there should be no requirement. I take this to be almost a normative claim. There should be no requirement that I get the model for the outcome correctly specified, because all I control in the trial is the probability of treatment. I shouldn't have to behave as if I am omniscient with respect to the outcome. So model robust means I can be wrong and still get the right answer. Of course, this is not magic. The reason it can be done is because I have randomization. When I say marginal treatment effect, I mean some average over all the people in the trial. And large samples, I mean that you can't really hope for the best in teeny trials, but once you get in the hundreds, you would want things to work out, and they tend to do. There is possibility of improvements in strict finite samples, but I'm not going to talk too much about that case. Okay, so these results are not mine, by the way, but I think they're very beautiful, but they have one little problem, okay? And the problem is the robustness claim means that you don't have to depend on the model being correct, which is nice. But the efficiency claim, the claim that I can do the most efficient possible analysis, the analysis that extracts all the information available in the trial data, that claim depends on my ability to model the outcome correctly, which, as I tried to say before, I am very pessimistic. I don't feel lucky about my ability to model outcomes correctly, even in trials. And so what happens is I would want to use data adaptive methods, think machine learning, AI, that kind of thing in the trial to estimate the model for the outcome. But my trial budget, in terms of humans participating at least, runs out before I can achieve optimality, because those methods require large sample sizes to flexibly model the outcome regression. And so I am in a difficult spot because it's hard to learn good models using trial data alone, but then I really need a good model in order to recover the efficiency benefits of using an outcome regression. And so what is the possible solution? We and others, many others, have of course thought of the idea of using the external data to gain efficiency or power, as in Lorenzo's example, using external data. Almost always, that also comes with some extra assumptions. But the idea is to use rich, big external data I was thinking of older trials, registries, EHRs, maybe one day the database that Dan is putting together. And then I can do a couple of things. I can do pure external controls, so I won't even have randomization. This is, of course, a limiting extreme case. I will only have the one single experimental arm, and I will use my observational data to create appropriate controls that, as far as I can tell, at least requires very strong assumptions that perhaps in a design-forward way can be partially addressed, but will always be there. You have to know enough about the problem you're studying for the assumptions to make sense. Or the second alternative that I want to focus on is a hybrid or fusion design, where what we're going to do is we're going to maybe run an overall smaller trial, but where part of the control group or part of both groups in some cases will be replaced by external data. And here, I say this also requires assumptions, but it's a plus minus, because I want to argue that by having randomization in a smaller trial, or possibly a trial with an equal randomization, you can get away with no assumptions beyond those justified by the randomization. Okay, so basically the way I view the whole thing is you ask yourself if you feel lucky when you're designing your study. And we heard from the other speakers about the rigorous data requirements for something like this. And we also heard about all the strong assumptions that are needed. There are assumptions, I call them, of alignment between the external data and the trial. You need the trial environment to be not meaningfully different, at least from the external data. You almost always need no confounding assumptions in the external data if there exists variation in treatment. You need some assumption of transportability between the external data and your trial. You need some overlapping distributions when you're adjusting for covariates. And still, there's going to be reliance on modeling, so you need to get some of your models right. And so, as I said, I personally don't feel very lucky. And so I always ask myself, what should I do given that I don't feel very lucky today? And so one strategy is to take a chance, and that will be the way to go when there is no possibility at all, for instance, for randomization, or when the rarity of the disease or the low frequency of the outcome makes a randomized trial almost meaningless. In those cases, we have to take a chance, which we have a lot of methods and ideas for how to do it. The second approach, of course, is to use design. You can get your external non-experimental data prospectively. This Dan, I think, covered completely. And then you can do a lot of analytical things to match the non-experimental data to the experimental data. That seems also very reasonable to always do. But what I wanted to say a little bit more on is when you can use randomization, at least in a smaller way. Maybe you can create an imbalanced allocation with more people assigned into the experimental treatment, or perhaps you can have a smaller trial overall. So in that case, can we have a smart way to reduce sample size requirements? And so the class of methods I wanted to mention, we call it trial augmentation. Certainly we have done some work in the space. A lot of others have alternative methods. They all tend to be equivalent in large samples. They perform different in finite samples, so there's always a need to compare. But all these methods, what they do is they exploit randomization for robustness. So again, we're not going to require any extra assumptions. And they then exploit the external data to get efficiency improvements. And the idea is if the external data is massive, the models I can fit can be very data adaptive, so I can approximate the true regression more and use that in my trial instead of relying on the relatively limited trial data alone. And I'm not allowed any mathematics in this symposium, so I will be extremely hand-wavy. But the idea is I go in the external data and I do my best. I apply your favorite, most flexible data adaptive method, and I can fix that if I want entirely before I even start the trial. So I can use a beautiful rich registry to learn my models, and then there will be no multiple looks, no possibility for data snooping, nothing like that, and I can pre-specify the analysis of the trial that will use those models, and I can lock them in a box. And so the regulators will be, I think, happy. And then what I do is I make a traditional, as I was saying, my preference would be efficient, model, robust estimator using the trial data alone. And then I can create 2 or more, actually, estimators that use the models I learned in the external data. And then I will take these and I will combine them into one final estimator. And it's nice to have one final estimator because that means I'll have a single number and a single p-value, which again is attractive from a regulatory standpoint. And I can give some statistical guarantees for that combined estimator. One is in terms of efficiency, precision, variance, it will do no worse than each of the components. So if you are lucky and the external data is great and aligned with the trial, then you're going to get benefits. But if you are unlucky, which is my fear in life, then you don't have to rely on the external data being aligned. You will do no worse than the trial-only analysis. It feels like statistical black magic. This is the hand-wavy part. Trust me, I'm a doctor, or read the papers. Okay, and then what do? I have this combined estimator, and I wanted to show that it has certain adaptive properties. So one way it adapts, think of the 2 parts, the trial-only result and the result that uses the external data. I'm combining them together with some kind of weight, and if that weight goes to 0, I'm using only the trial data. So here's an example where the model is not correctly specified, and so as I get a bigger and bigger sample size, my data is teaching me to ignore the external information. I put more and more weight, because when I go to lambda 0, I'm going to be using only the trial data. But since there is always some information in the external data, the weights here don't really go all the way to 0. Here is another example where what we do is we simulate more and more bias in the external data. We make it more and more misaligned. And so this weight now is, as you can see, with more bias, which is the most in the purple color, it essentially learns to zero out the external data. So it discounts it and it's not affected. And I can't go into details, but the methods, ours and other people's in the same class, they seem to be able to give unbiased finite sample results. They are consistent, asymptotically normal, so we know how to make confidence intervals. They have alpha levels that are near nominal, which is nice for the regulator. They have coverage that's 95%. And for the purists among us, we are even able to do exact tests. So you can use a modification of the methods to do an exact test like the Fisher test. So in principle, your alpha level is controlled even with as few as 5 or 6 people. You can get the right answer. I don't recommend running trials of 5 people, but the math works out in finite samples. And here's how it works for efficiency. This is an interesting result, I think, because the baseline in green is the most efficient trial-only result. And you can see that that estimator is actually not great in this simulated example. Actually, this is real data. It is a reanalysis of cardiovascular data. And so what you can see is when we subsample the trial, like Lorenzo was doing, in small samples, the unadjusted estimator is better than the most efficient trial-only estimator. But in all sample sizes, the proposed combined estimator with the property of robustness and doing no worse than the components confirms those theoretical properties, and it dominates the other 2. So the idea is if you are going to use either the unadjusted or the best efficient adjusted, we can help you do a little better by using external data essentially for free. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to touch on is how would we go about planning a study like this? Because in theory and in simulations and in reanalyzing old trial data, it's easy to have a result, but the proof will be in designing a new study. And so I think there is scope, as there is for other complicated estimation, analysis, design strategies for simulation-informed design. We can use now massive, very rich observational data. We can have generative models that are essentially indistinguishable from the underlying data. And then we can implement the methods, ours, other people's, to select modeling approaches, estimators, optimization strategies, any aspect of the machine learning that you will do in learning the data, and come up with the design that has the properties desirable for a specific application. You can examine performance on as big a class of designs as you need, and you can have a very classical attitude if you wish. You can use the simulations to determine power, coverage, false positive error rates, and make your decision. And all that can be done entirely in a pre-specified way before touching the actual trial data. And with this.